Hello, everyone, and welcome to this short overview of utilitarianism. In this animation, I will give you the basic history and theory of utilitarianism, along with some ways this ethical theory is being used in our world today. The ideas of utilitarianism are everywhere in our culture, and there is always some wisdom in learning the basics of such an influential theory. And as always, in my summary videos, just remember this is the barest basics of the topic. I like to begin by stressing that philosophical ideas and ethics that affect our daily life do not somehow magically pop into existence. Just like us, philosophers were embedded in their own culture, with all of the complexity, good, bad, that this implies. Aristotle, the main founder of virtue ethics, was a student of the greatest ancient Greek philosopher, Plato. They both lived in Athens, the first formal attempt at a democracy, and neither of them really liked it. And Aristotle would soon become the personal tutor of Alexander the Great, who went on to conquer most of the known world at the time. Likewise, Immanuel Kant lived in what we can say were interesting times. Science was changing so overwhelmingly fast that it was hard to keep up. The French Revolution killed 17,000 aristocrats and their supporters under the bloody blade of the guillotine. And even more importantly to Kant, a Scottish philosopher, David Hume, was writing deceptively radical philosophy that Kant himself admits shocked him out of his own dogmatic slumber. Everything is embedded in culture, and philosophy is no different. And though we will mostly focus on the utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill, Mill got his first push from the ideas of his father's friend, Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was a wonderfully weird and brilliant thinker. He was a lifelong activist in women's rights and prison reform. His love of fairness and justice was everywhere in his ideas and in his work. But he was also just a quirky guy. He actually bequeathed his preserved body to University College London, which he helped co-found, so he could attend meetings after his death. And believe it or not, they still roll him out of that case you see right there from time to time. His foundational idea in ethics was that you could do the math of happiness to decide the correct thing to do in every specific situation. His philosophic calculus had 7 categories. Things like intensity, propinquity, not a word you hear much these days, and he believed you could assign a number to each category. So, if you were trying to decide between studying for a test or going out with your friends, you would just sit down, go through the 7 items there, and do the math. And whichever answer came out higher would be the correct thing to do. This idea that we could somehow quantify happiness was part of what would become the utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill. Like Aristotle and Kant, John Stuart Mill's ideas grew out of his own culture. And to be clear right from the start, he thought that culture was deeply unjust. This was a time of enormous economic and population growth in Victorian England. Factories, mills, mines, and workhouses were everywhere. But shocking poverty was part of this economic progress. If anything, Charles Dickens' graphic stories of poverty are too mild to describe it. Backbreaking labor and child labor drove much of this economic growth. In what they called progressive new laws in the 1850s, Parliament decided to limit the work week of 9 to 16-year-old children to a maximum of 60 hours a week. And at the same time, women around England were fighting for any recognition or relevance. Men controlled every part of their lives, from birth to education to who they would marry. So they set out to get the vote and their fair share of political power. Women's suffrage became one of the most divisive issues of the 1800s in England. So in a time when there was a massive economic gain, almost all of that gain was going to a very small group of people. Some things never seemed to change. This was Mill's culture, and he wanted it to change. So taking a germ of quantification from Bentham, Mill came up with the radical idea that one person's happiness should count the same as another person's happiness. Now this might seem simple or obvious, but pause for a minute and think about it. The world today, and ask yourself whether we've even come close to this ideal. This underlying idea about happiness will become the source of his utilitarianism. The core of this idea is called the happiness principle, and here you can see it in Mill's own words. I'm arguing that it's radical because Mill does not care if it is the happiness of a 9-year-old coal miner thrilled to only be working 60 hours this week, or the happiness of the unbelievably wealthy and powerful Queen Victoria. His principle is centered on happiness in total, and everyone's happiness gets to count. We'll go into some of the detail and fine-tuning of this idea in a minute, but there's a second, almost equally vital idea connected to utilitarianism. The morality of an action, for Mill, comes from the consequences of the action, and not from the intentions behind an action, like it does for Kant. If the consequences of some action can make 10 coal mining children happy, but the Queen is unhappy, then this consequence is the correct choice. And not only is it the correct choice, for Mill, it is the moral choice. The consequences equal the morality. It is hard to stress how radical this idea might be if a society practiced it, and that is just how Mill intended it to be. Before we move on to some of the finer points of Mill's idea, let me briefly correct some common ways people go wrong when they first encounter this idea. Despite the clear words of Mill, many people still want to value their own happiness above that of other people. If you learn that an action will make a lot of people happy, but you will be unhappy, you do not get your way here. The consequences, not your individual views, determine right and wrong. Your happiness, of course, counts, but it only counts as one, the same as everyone else. A second common misconception is that Mill is talking only about base pleasure, the Victorian version of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. These are pleasures that do count, but there are other, more important pleasures as well, which we'll see in a moment. Finally, this morality is focused on large-scale decisions. If you want to do something individual, something damaging to yourself, and no one else is hurt in any way, then Mill does not really believe this is an important question for morality. Now, the very first question many early critics of Mill asked was, what does he mean by happiness? And he answers by splitting happiness into two different levels. He calls them higher and lower pleasures. The lower pleasures are just the kind of thing I mentioned earlier, the fleeting but undeniable bodily pleasures, what I jokingly called sex, drugs, and rock and roll pleasures. These are pleasures that almost everyone has felt. But Mill also argues that there are different, higher pleasures. And these are things like beauty and intellectual pursuits. Most of us have also had that burst of pleasure from working through a long, difficult math problem. We're not really quite sure whether we got it right. But after looking to the back of the book, we see we did get it right. And there's a burst of pleasure comes through. Or we're walking along in a late afternoon, turning to look, and all of a sudden we catch our breath as we watch the pastel colors when the sun drops below the horizon. For Mill, these are not the same as the lower pleasures, but they are strong pleasures nevertheless. And for Mill, really, higher pleasures are higher than lower pleasures. One fun way to understand the tension and interaction between higher and lower pleasures is to imagine a public question. Should we build an opera house, symbolizing higher pleasure, or a new football stadium, symbolizing lower pleasure? This, for Mill, is a hard question. If we just put it up to a vote of the most happiness in total, way more people would prefer the undeniable joy of a football stadium. But as we saw with the pleasure of a math problem solved or a stunning sunset, there's also a point to the higher pleasure of an opera house. On difficult questions to handle like these, Mill comes up with the compelling idea of a competent judge. A competent judge is a person who has experienced the pleasure of screaming for your team in a packed stadium while beer is spilled on your foot by your equally loud neighbor next to you in the stands. And the competent judge has also felt the vibrant, almost overwhelming mix of pleasure and tears brought on by an opera singer reaching heights in a language you don't even speak. For Mill, only a person who has fully experienced both the higher and lower pleasures is in a position to judge this type of a question. Now, I'm sure that Mill imagines he is this competent judge. just as I imagine it is me, as I've had both the tears from the opera and the beer spilled on my foot. Now, it's certain that Mill gives precedence to the higher pleasures, but he does not discount the lower pleasures. They are also an important part of happiness. And it is the competent judge who can best understand the tension and value in each type of pleasure. Utilitarianism has had countless effects on our world. Like many philosophies that are behind our political, cultural, or economic life, its effect is often unrecognized or even ignored. But we are swimming in the water of philosophy all the time, whether we realize it or not. As they often do, academic philosophers have been arguing and modifying utilitarianism for 200 years, if we include the work of Jeremy Bentham. They have largely split into two camps: act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. I mention this only to highlight that the focus and structure of the ideal version of utilitarianism is still an open and active debate. And around us, we see the hints of utilitarianism. They have shown up in trolley problem memes and Netflix series about ethics. But much more important to our daily lives is the work of a thinker like Peter Singer, the most famous living utilitarian. He's written many books and been a philosophical activist for much of his life. He's most famous for two main things: his arguments about the ethical treatment of animals and his founding of the effective altruism movement. His book, Animal Liberation, was the founding work behind the ethical treatment of animals. I am sure that Singer has created more vegetarians than any person alive by a large margin. I know it affected me quite a bit. His arguments are quite powerful, and if you're a fair person, it's hard to read this 1975 book and come away unaffected. His second influence has been effective altruism. In this work, he has taken his explicitly utilitarian arguments into the world of charity. Here they use a strict utility argument to find the most effective use of money, and then to get the largest measurable consequences for every dollar. Really, it's an amazingly effective work, and millions of lives have been improved or saved by this work. And once again, he has had an outsized effect on this world-changing view of charity. Now, he's not the only thinker in this area, but he is still one of the most influential. The newest outgrowth of utilitarianism is called long-termism, and it takes some of the utilitarian methods and applies them to the future and future human possibilities, arguing that our actions today should be determined in part or wholly by these possible futures and future people. This idea is still new and a bit controversial, but has become quite influential in certain parts of Silicon Valley and growing importance and growing political influence. With these real-life examples in mind, here is the minimum to take away from this animation. The most important idea is the happiness principle, but a close second is that the consequences are what we should be looking at in morality. Then, if you add in the details of the interaction between higher and lower pleasures, ideally decided by a competent judge of both types of pleasure, that is the core of John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. Now, remember, as always, to contact me if you would like to learn more or get some reading recommendations about this topic.